And if you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 12. I'm going to try to move through this story quickly. There's a lot with Abraham's stories, and so I wasn't sure exactly what to cover. But God led me to one that I don't think I normally would preach, which is kind of the journey part, not the first few verses of chapter 12, which is common, and not some of the other things, but there's a lot in the ups and downs of Abraham's story, so I want to look at that. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis 12, and I'll tell you a quick story to get us in. There was a parade in Milan, Italy, a few years ago, and it was the summer, and so if you know anything about Italy, they have big churches with big church doors that they leave open in the summer. And the parade was going through, and there was an elephant who veered off and actually went into a church and looked around and trumpeted a little bit. And the tamers were able to direct him back out. He didn't do any damage somehow, and he got back on the parade route. And I wonder how many of us are like that elephant. And we come here week by week, and we parade in, and we trumpet a little bit, and we look around, and then we get back on our route and just keep going. And so Abram, who he is at this time, is going to understand what we must understand as well, is that we can't be elephants. We can't be people who our response, our relationship, our connection with God is to come in week after week and then go back out. But that to follow Christ Jesus, to follow Yahweh, is a full surrender. We just sang it. It wasn't by accident. Here is where I lay it down. You are all I'm living for now. This is my surrender. And so Abraham, or Abram, I'll probably go back and forth. It's Abram the whole story. He doesn't get his name changed till later, but you all know who I'm talking about. Abram is not seeking God. He is somewhere in Macedonia, and God calls him and begins to meet with him. Acts chapter 6 tells us that even before we get it in Genesis 12, somehow Stephen knew that God had already revealed himself when he was still there, and then he revealed himself again in Haran and told him to come down, and that's what we know about. But God came to Abram. When Abram wasn't looking for him, Abram was in a different people group, a Chaldean. He was in Ur. But God identified him to meet with him. But when he does, when God calls us, and none of us choose to be called, but when God calls us, responsibility then takes place. And it's more than to just show up on Sundays. It's more than to help set up. It's more than to be a good person. And so we're going to see what Abram learns. Chapter 12, verse 1. After he had already met with him before, the Lord comes back, and he said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Okay, so that's the call. Go. Leave your people, leave your family, leave your home, and go to the place I will show you. Well, where is that, God? Just start walking, and I'll show you. So it's okay not to know the end. Praise the Lord. This church plant would be way harder if I had to know where we were going. But we know where we're supposed to be today. And it's right here in this text. He says, "Go and I will show you. I'll begin to show you things." And so the call is to leave. But with every call comes a promise. And we know that in our own lives. But here's the promise to Abram. "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So what's the blessing? I'm going to make you into a family. And through your family, the whole world is going to be blessed. Yes, I just disinherited all the people, but I have a plan to bring them back, and this is the plan through you and your wife. My wife can't have kids. I'm really old. I know, you're perfect. Nobody will think you did anything. Come with me. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to bless you. And who else is he going to bless? And this plays into our story, so it's important. Who else is going to be blessed? Everybody who's connected to Abram. I will bless you and make your name great. And I will bless those who bless you. And those who curse you, those who come against you, they've made their stand, and it's with the wrong group. And those I will curse. But attachment to Abram means attachment to blessing. And where's the blessing going to be? It's going to be in the land that I will show you. You see, especially here, the land is important. The land represents the will of God. For us, there's not a land. For Abram, there was. There was a specific piece of earth. And when he stayed in those boundaries, the promise stayed with him. The blessing stayed with him because he was in the call. Because that was the call. Leave and go to this place. With us, it's a little different. It's not a place. It's not a sanctuary or a hallway or a service project. It's the will of God. Whatever that might be. I can't tell you all the specific wills of God for your life. Prayer, fasting, listening. God will give you specific wills, but 2 Thessalonians 4 tells us this is the will of God for your life. It was one of my favorite verses to preach when I was in youth ministry because the kids are like, what's the will of God for my life? And they mean, who am I going to marry? Where am I going to go to college? What am I going to major in? And those are all important things. And so I'd say, you want to know the will of God for your life? And I'd turn to that passage. And I'd say, this is the will of God for your life. I think it's 2 Thessalonians 4:3, but I didn't write it down. It might be first. I get those confused. But he says, this is the will of God for your life, your sanctification. And then he says, what's your sanctification? It's to abstain from things, it's to flee from the flesh, and it's to love people. And they never liked that answer, of course, because they wanted to know the name of the college or the military or whatever. But that's the truth. God's will for your life is to walk with him. Your sanctification, which means your holiness. God making you holy every day at a time, walking by the Spirit. And when you do that, when you are with God, you can never miss his will. You can never be outside of his will. And then he will slowly show you, oh, I followed God and I looked up and I'm at Texas A&M. And when I was growing up, I was a Longhorn fan. I hated Texas A&M. I never would have thought, but I just followed God and I looked up and here I am. And I followed God and I met a girl. As soon as I said, okay, Lord, I trust you. I'm not going to look anymore. And then I met a girl. Her name was Dean. And I was like, where'd you come from? I was following God, but here you are. And that's how God's will unfolds. He led me to apply. He told me I was going to be a church planter. Then he told me I wasn't. And I said, how in the world can both of those be true? And then I see the Wells posting. And I said, oh, wow, that's pretty specific, Lord. But that's what he does because his will for you is to walk with him and to every day wake up and say, Paul, you're dead. Your life is in God's hands. I surrender. I trust you. And I know that you own a cattle on 1,000 hills, so I trust you. And I know that you will never leave me nor forsake me, so I trust you. And I know that you make good for those who love you and are called according to your purposes, so I trust you. And that's all he wants from Abram. Just walk with me. And so Abram begins well, and he does this, and he has the promise. But Abram, and it's not the biggest fault, all right? We're not Sodom and Gomorrah later. We're not Babel. But Abram doesn't know Yahweh fully yet. He doesn't know how to trust him, and so he's learning. And I do believe that's why God builds. And the call to sacrifice Isaac at the end of his life is way harder because now you know who I am. And Abram actually, it's the first time he does it perfectly. It's the hardest call. But God expects you to learn him, to find out who he is, to test him. You know, you're supposed to test God when he tells you to. Test and approve my good, perfect, and pleasing will. Romans 12:1 and 2. And so that's what Abram does. But look what Abram does. So Abram went. Good job, Abram. Go. And he went. That's great. And as the Lord had told him, the narrator tells us he did good. Uh-oh. and Lot went with him. What did he tell Abram to do? Go and leave your family. And so he left all his family except his nephew. Now, we don't know exactly why he took Lot, but it's important to look at the text. It says, after this, and Abram took Sarai, his wife, who God told him to, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan when they came to the land of Canaan. A lot of theys, right? Why do I show you that? Well, later there's going to be he's. He's going to learn his lesson. But most importantly, to show you, he was not responsible for Lot. He had not adopted Lot. He had not taken over Lot. Lot inherited his father's stuff. Lot had his own wife, and he had his own stuff. That's why there's a they. And so Abram didn't have to take Lot. And we know he's told not to take Lot. So why did he take Lot? Well, because Abram knows he's supposed to have an heir. And he knows his wife can't bear children. And he knows he's old. And so, though he believes God, and it's credited to him as righteous, I think he always believed he would have a family. He didn't know Yahweh the way he will learn Yahweh. And so he's like, I better have a backup option. I better help God a little bit. So he brings Lot with him. And he misses the full call that God has given him. But it's okay, he's learning God, and we're going to see that he corrects it later. And then the Lord appeared to Abram, and he said, to your offspring, that's a little more specific, I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord from whom he had appeared. So this is the first act. It's a call and it's a promise. And the only thing you need to see is that, one, he brought Lot with him, and two, he went into the land just like he was told. He pitched his tent. He built an altar to the Lord in verse 8. There he built an altar to the Lord, and he called upon the name of the Lord. What's he supposed to do? Call upon the name of the Lord. To call on the name of the Lord is to just say, God, I need you. I call on you. You are my God. I trust in you. I can do nothing without you. I've stepped out of all my resources, all my familiarity. I'm out of my comfort zone, God, but I'm calling on you. And this is a scary place to be, and it's the absolute best place you and I can ever be, moment by moment, to say, God, you have to come through. Manly Beasley used to say, brother, what are you counting on the Lord for that if he doesn't come through, you're sunk? And of course, people would be like, I don't know, nothing. He's like, one kid I was reading in his biography, he asked this young boy, and he said, nothing, Mr. Beasley. He says, well, at least you're honest. He's like, usually people make something up, and it's a total lie. At least you told me there's nothing. Because most of us don't live that way. Most of us don't live in a way that if God doesn't come through, we are sunk. Because it's scary, and it's hard. But when God gives us a word, and that's important, this is not, I'm just going to take another step and, hey, God's going to help. But if I heard a voice and you heard it too and he said step, now I got to trust. And so prayer, fasting, getting a word from the Lord. But once we have that word, once he says go, he is all we cling to. And when this happens, God almost always will test you. And so Act 2 is that test. He says, trust me in the land. And what does he tell him? He says, you're going to have offspring. And he's more specific. It's not Lot. This is your seed. Now, he doesn't know yet. I mean, he should know. But God has not explicitly said it's Sarah's seed. Later he will. He say it's going to come from your body and Sarah's body. So don't try that Hagar stuff again. But he hasn't said it yet. But here he does say it's going to be your seed, and that was the biological term. Your child. Your biological child. It's not Lot. So what should Abram know? I cannot die until I have a child. I am invincible if God is true to his word and all-powerful. And so that's all he can know for sure. But he knows it might be hard. but I cannot die. And if he believed that it would be from Sarah, she can't either. And so what does God do? He tests that faith, and he's going to test your faith. When you say, okay, God, I'm all yours. Without you, I'm sunk. He's going to test your faith. He's going to say, do you trust me? And here's how he does it in this story. He sends a famine. They don't have food. They don't have water. I don't know how severe the famine was. It doesn't give us any details. It just says, now there was a famine in the land. So Abram prayed to God, who is in control of the land. No, that's not what it says. It's what it should say. And so it shows a test and a response. The test is there was a famine where? In the land. In the land is a huge phrase. It always means the promised land, the place I'm going to show you, the land. And there was a famine in the land. So Abram left the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. And when he was about to enter Egypt, he and his wife Sarah, he said, I know that you're beautiful. When they asked, tell them you're my sister, so they don't kill me and take you as a wife. Now, we're not going to look at that whole story, but it's an important story because it shows what Abram does. Abram says, I got to take control of this situation. My family's hungry, and I got to go somewhere. I've got to take us somewhere that I can provide. And I've got to protect my own skin, and maybe my wife's too, but I'm the promised one. You do see a sense here where Abram is throwing his wife to the wolves to protect himself. He's no longer trusting in God. And you need to understand this. You cannot do both. You cannot have control and take matters into your own hands and also trust God by faith. Can't do it. And I put an asterisk there. You can either have control or faith, but let's be honest. Do we ever really have control? What does the Bible say? You don't know what tomorrow, what did Danny read? Son of man, you don't know what tomorrow will bring. Man builds a huge barn to hold all the stuff, and the next day God demands his life. And so we really don't have any control. Abram didn't decide to have a famine. He didn't have any control. But we think we have control. But I want you to understand you cannot have control and faith. You've got to release control to God to have faith. Or you have to leave your faith. Say, God, I cannot trust you in this situation. I know you've told me to do this, but I just don't believe you. You told me this is good, but I can't see how, so I'm not going to do it. You've told me to forgive, but there's just no way that's the best thing for me today. And so I'm not going to do it. And we take control. We wrestle control back from God. But control and faith never exist together. And so that's what Abram does. He takes control. And what happens? Man, terrible stuff happens. They take his wife. It doesn't go into details, but I just cannot imagine that conversation afterwards, the apologies, the excuses. But the shame that Abram must feel because God had to come rescue his wife. The wife has been taken into Pharaoh's room, into Pharaoh's quarters. But God protected her. And he basically cursed Pharaoh because he's already made a promise. Anyone who curses you, I'm going to curse, and he takes care of it. It's a really cool picture, if we had time to look at it, of Abram is basically Israel later. He leaves, he goes down to Egypt. God sends plagues to Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells him to go. Sounds familiar. The Israelites would have thought, oh, God's done this before. But that's what he does. And now, where's Abram? He's got to be at a point where he says, I've done unspeakable things in Egypt. God went and found me. God called me to trust him, and I didn't do it. And I've made shambles of my life. I've made shambles of my life. And you've done unspeakable things too. And I have. And I know them. And God has told me to obey him. And when I obey him, everything good happens. And I've rejected that. And I've run away from him to Egypt taking my life in my own hands for fun, for pleasure, out of fear, out of guilt, out of jealousy, out of anger, you name it. And I said, no, God, I'm doing it my way. And I've made a total mess of my life in those situations. And you have too. You've done unspeakable things in Egypt. So what do you do with them? Well, you do exactly what Abram did. You go back up. Just turns around. And in fact, it's Pharaoh that tells him. He tells him the same thing God already told him. Go and leave. Take your wife and go. And so verse 1 of chapter 13, we see the ascent of Abram. He's gone down into Egypt, but he's going back up. So Abram went to Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. He goes back into the land. Do you see that? Now, I don't know about Abram. We have the cross. So we know that forgiveness is always available. We know, the Bible is very clear, that where sin increases, grace increases all the more. I don't know if Abram knew that. I think Abram knew, hey, he's a good God, let's go give it a shot. But maybe he'll just bless me. Maybe I'm not the one anymore who the promise is for. Maybe I've already blown that. But let's just see how good, gracious this God is. And Abram does an experiment, and he heads back. And he goes back where? Verse 3. Back to the place his tent had been at the beginning. When you go down into Egypt, when you make a mess of your life, remember the time you were close to the Lord and just go back there. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to dig yourself back out of that hole. You just go back to the place you started and call on the name of the Lord. That's what he does. To the first place that he had built an altar. And there Abram called again. It's not there, but I like to add again upon the name of the Lord. And so we see Abram return. What does he do? He repents and reconstitute his life to the Lord. He says, God, I'm sorry. I made a mistake taking my life into my own hands, but I'm back where I started and I'm calling on your name again. Is God a God of second chances? We'll see. Well, praise the Lord, he is. Abram will learn. But God doesn't answer him here. God hasn't spoken to him yet, so he's still probably wondering, but he looks up and he sees all that God has already blessed him with. And Lot's men and Lot are fighting against his men and his sons, and he says it's time to split up. And I think there may be I hope, because the text tells us no longer did they go, he went, and he journeyed back, and Lot was still with him, but it's now he. I think he understands God's original call. He says, we got to split up. You take whatever you want. I trust in a good God. He's going to take care of me. I've tried to take this into my own hands. I'm not doing it today. You pick. And look what he says. And this is important. He says, is not the whole land, verse 9 of 13, is not the whole land before you. Separate yourself from me. If you take the left, I'll go right. If you take right, I'll go left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. What happens here? Abram says, look at the land. This is all the place of promise. You pick one side, I'll take the other. You want the hills, I'll take the valley. You want the valley, I'll take the hills. But what does Abraham said? Look at the land. What does Lot do? Lot looks at the valley of the Jordan. It's not called the land here because it's outside, and physically, geographically, it is outside of the promised land. And he says, I want to go there because that place has water. That place is lush. That place has cities. That place has everything to care for me. It's like Egypt. That's negative, by the way, but it's not for somebody. We just went down to Egypt and they had all the stuff. It's like the Garden of Eden. It's got water, it's got rivers. What's Lot doing? Lot's making a totally rational decision, but it's not one of faith. There are many things in this world that you and I look at and we say, this makes perfect sense. I need to live with my boyfriend or girlfriend before I get married. It makes perfect sense. I can get to know them. We can save on budgets. We can save on finances. We can find out if we're compatible. It makes perfect sense. What's the only problem? It's not in the land. Holding on to a grudge, punishing somebody, when they have hurt me, hurting them back, makes perfect sense. It's just not in the land. Holding on to all my finances, even being wise with them, but certainly not turning over 10% to the Lord, makes perfect sense. Makes no sense to live on 90 when I can live on 100. It's not rational. It's just not in the land. And so what you and I have to do is what Abram does. And he says, I've gone it my own way. And yeah, that place is lush, and it looks like Eden, and there is green grass, and rivers, and mountains, and valleys. But it's not Eden. Because what made Eden great is that God was there. Not because it had rivers, not because it had all the trees. So he says, I am staking my claim to Yahweh, and I'm going to live in His will. And brothers and sisters, you have choices within His will. You can go north, you can go south, you can go east, you can go west. But when we step out of the land, we take control. We take our life into our own hands. And we better hope that water doesn't run out. And he's going to find out that he made a bad choice. The narrator tells us, oh yeah, he picked the place that's going to get burned up. They take divergent paths. Act 3. The land or the valley. The land offers God. The valley offers everything else. Enemy is going to always show you all the good things. He offered Jesus what? The whole world. He says, you can have all these kingdoms. You just have to bow to me. Jesus says, no, I choose God. I will go God's path, even if it's a cross, even if it's suffering. Because God is what I need. Eden is Eden because God is there. Heaven is heaven, not because there are streets of gold, but because God is there. And so I'm going to stay in the land. And as soon as they separated, and Abram settles where? Verse 12. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley. And the ESV says, and moved his tent as far as Sodom, but the Hebrew is actually, and placed his tent toward Sodom. It's this picture of as soon as we choose the world over God, we start down a slippery slope. And his tent is now facing Sodom. And maybe I'm not going to go all the way in, and he doesn't. He stays sort of righteous, but I just want to be closer and closer and begin moving my tent closer and closer to Sodom. Because I've left the Lord. And so this is just a quick Venn diagram, but it's that idea is that God's will is the land. And we all have our own choices, but only when we choose to live in God's will is blessing there. And that is what Lot forgets. This is the only rationality that Lot forgot. He saw the rivers, he saw the water, he saw the streams, he saw the fertility, but he forgot about this Venn diagram, that blessing only occurs in God's will. And in his case, connected to Abram. So he should have said, hey, I'll go wherever you want, but I'm not leaving you because I heard the promise. God said whoever's attached to you is blessed. But Lot doesn't have faith. Abram does. And after this happens, look at this. The Lord said to Abram, when? Verse 14. After Lot had separated from him. He gets a true fresh start. He didn't know, but God is a God of second chances. And so you can go to the last act, and he says, I surrender, I'm all in. And the grace of God is so amazing. He has a once-in-a-lifetime offer. I will make all your dreams come true. I will give you the promises. You just have to leave everything and follow me. And Abram doesn't do it. And I wonder, is God's call, and it's so good that no person who sees the treasure for what it was will ever say no to it, and yet sometimes we do. And we only have ourselves to blame. We stand before the Lord and He's like, I showed you. You were at camp and you knew this was true. And you rejected it. And we have no one to blame. And a fair God, we could say, hey, you're right. You gave me an honest shot and I blew it. And He says, and guess what? Now you get another once-in-a-life chance. Like, I thought it was a once-in-a-life. It was. And here's another one. And here's another one. I wanted to share a quick story to close. This happened to me not long ago. God had been working in my life. Some of you remember when I came back from the prayer retreat from Brooklyn Tabernacle. I went and visited Brooklyn Tabernacle. It's been over 2 years now. And I knew God was calling me to essentially a restart and a full surrender. And I did, and He called me to go forward and to confess some things. And I'm in a safe place. People in Brooklyn, they don't know me. And so I went down, and then at the last moment, I chickened out, and I confessed, but it was vague. It wasn't what God told me to say. But God was still so gracious. He wasn't like, well, you didn't do what I told you to do. You took Lot with you. You did all the rest, but you took Lot with you. No, you know what He did? He overwhelmed me with grace and goodness. And He didn't ever needle, and to the point where I'd forgotten that there was actually one little piece of obedience that I didn't do because God didn't bring it up, and God was still faithful, and God still flooded us with answered prayers and with beautiful miracles and transformations. And that continued and carried on to prayer retreat and so many other things. And then, a few months ago at Tres Dias, there was a moment for more confession and really continuing to come to the Lord. And it's the first time in 2 years, that I'd remembered that moment at Brooklyn Tabernacle of what I would call failure. And I remember even in that moment, God's just going to have to forgive me. There will never be another moment like this. I missed it. But God's still good, and He doesn't remind me of that, and He still blesses me even though I didn't fully surrender the way I could. And it's the first time He ever reminded me of that failure. And He didn't do it to needle me. He didn't do it to say, you're not quite who you think you are. He did it to say, you thought you'd never have another chance. But this is the chance. And I did it. And I said exactly what I was supposed to say. I ran down, I shared, and it was this moment that Abram had. It was you will never have another chance to do this. And you're a failure, is what the enemies want to tell me. And God said, no, you're not. I love you. It's okay. But then He gave me another once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do what I didn't do the first time. And so some of you have run down to Egypt, and you think you never have another chance to go back to where you started. But this is a miracle kind of God. And Abram found out that his grace was so much greater. His grace was so much greater that even when he spoke out loud to him and had a revelation and he met this God he wasn't looking for, and he says, all you have to do is follow me and leave Lot behind, and he still took Lot, that God didn't give up on him and go find another Abram. God remembered, God worked in his life, and then when Abram finally did what he was supposed to do at first, he got the full blessing. There was a blessing that I did not get 2 years ago. God didn't needle me, He didn't judge me, but there was a freedom that I knew I left on the table because I didn't confess. And I'm just going to have to carry that. It's just a freedom I'll miss. But God's good enough to overcome it. He gave me another chance to find that freedom. And I took it. And I don't regret it at all. I wonder, is there something that a part of your life, and you say, man, I'm walking with the Lord, but there is a part that I've never had the courage to tell somebody. I've never had the courage to give this to God. This part of my life, whether it's finances, whether it's job, whether it's my marriage, whether it's confession. You say, today's the day. I'm leaving lot. God, I'm really all in. If you don't come through, I am sunk. But I'm all in. I want the promise. I want the land. I want to be in your will. And this thing is keeping me from your will. We have a gracious God. You had a chance a long time ago to lay that down and you didn't. Guess what? We have a gracious God. You can do it today. Today is that moment. It's come full circle, just like it did from Abram. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot separated, lift up your eyes and look. And he gives him the promise again. Everything I told you before is still true. You didn't screw it up. You just had to get back here so that I could tell you about it again. Would you pray?